Under a pale, wind-brushed sky, the prairie stretched in all directions, endless and unbroken. The air carried the dry scent of dust and sage, and the only sound was the steady thud of an axe biting into wood. She worked without hurry, each swing deliberate, the muscles in her arms taut from years of doing a man's labor. Her 2 children lingered nearby, her boys stacking the split logs. Her younger girl crouched low in the dirt, tracing lines with a stick. The cabin behind them was a squat, weathered thing, its boards grayed by sun and storm. The widow had stopped thinking of it as home. It was simply where they lived. The notion of comfort had been buried with her husband years ago, and now survival was the only measure of a day's success. The wind shifted, carrying with it a strange note, something different from the constant sigh of grass. She paused, listening. Her son noticed it first, a soft, irregular clop of hooves. It was the sound of a horse moving without a rider. He straightened, squinting toward the horizon. The shape came slowly into view, a paint horse, its flanks lathered, its gait uneven. Dark stains marred its coat. The axe slipped from her hands into the dirt. She knew better than to expect good news from a lone, blood-spattered animal. Her eyes darted over the open land, scanning for movement. There was nothing. She told the children to stay close, but her voice was low, tense. The horse halted at the edge of the yard, trembling, its breath harsh in the cold air. She stepped toward it, palm out, speaking in a calm, even tone. The reins hung loose, and the saddle bore deep scratches. A torn strip of leather dangled like a wound. She saw the trail then, hoof prints pressed into damp earth, broken grass stained dark. Following them, she found him. The man lay crumpled in a shallow dip of ground, face half hidden in the shadow of his hair. His skin was bronze, streaked with sweat and dirt, and across his chest lay the torn remains of what had been ceremonial war paint. His breathing was shallow, each exhale a ragged whisper. A broken shaft of an arrow jutted from beneath his ribs, and his clothes were shredded, revealing wounds both fresh and scarred. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She'd heard the stories, told in low voices over firelight, raiders, scalp takers, and men who could slit a throat without a sound. But she had also known loss and the cruelty of men who wore the language of law. The choice rose before her, like a drawn gun. Leave him here and let the land finish him, or bring him in and invite danger into her home. The children's faces flickered in her mind. Her son old enough to fetch water and wood, but still too young to fight. Her daughter too small to understand the dangers that walked on 2 legs. She went to her knees beside him, her shadow falling over his face. His eyelids fluttered, and for an instant his gaze locked with hers. His eyes were sharp even in their weakness, a dark, bottomless glare that spoke of both pride and pain. Then they rolled back, and he sagged against the earth. Her hands moved before her mind settled on the decision. She gripped his arm, testing his weight, and with a grunt she hauled him upright. He was heavier than he looked, his body limp with fever. The walk back to the cabin was slow and punishing, her boots sinking into the damp soil with each step. In the barn, she laid him down on a pile of old blankets. The air inside was warm from the animal's breath, thick with the smell of hay and leather. She found her knife and cut away the blood-stiffened claw from around the arrow wound. The shaft had come out. She braced one hand against his chest and pulled. His body arched with a muffled groan, but he didn't wake. Blood welled up hot against her fingers. She worked quickly, pressing clean rags of the wound, binding it tight. His skin burned with fever. In the flicker of the lantern light, she saw the marks on him, thin, pale scars crossing his arms, a crude tattoo of an eagle's claw inked into his shoulder. The talon in the tattoo was broken, as if part of the design had been altered. She set water to boil, her ears tuned to every creak of the barn and sigh of wind outside. Somewhere in the dark beyond the walls, coyotes yipped. She forced her mind not to wander to the men who might have put him in this state, whether they were still out there, whether they would come looking. The night grew heavier, the air thick with the smell of rain. The children had been ordered inside, the door barred. She sat on a stool beside the man, rifle leaning within arm's reach. His breathing was uneven, his lips dry and cracked. She wiped them with a damp cloth, the motion almost automatic. Hours passed. Once his eyes opened again. They were wild, disoriented, but they tracked her face. His lips moved, forming words she didn't understand. She told him to rest, though her voice was flat, cautious. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer. Then he slipped back into darkness. The storm came near midnight, sweeping across the plains in a rush of cold wind and needling rain. Each gust rattled the barn's loose boards. Thunder rolled low and long, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. She watched him through the shifting light, her mind circling the same thought over and over. She had brought a stranger into her life, and strangers carried trouble like dust on their boots. Lightning flashed, casting the barn in a hard white glow. In that brief moment she saw his face clearly. The fear set his jaw, the youth hidden beneath the blood and grime, and something else, something unnameable. When the darkness returned, it felt deeper. She tightened the blanket around his shoulders, sat back, and kept her hand near the rifle. Sleep would not come for her tonight. Somewhere beyond the rain, the prairie stretched on, empty and silent, yet she could not shake the feeling that the world was already shifting around them. He had been a dying man when she found him. By morning, she feared he might be something else entirely. Morning broke without ceremony. The light slowed to crawl across the flat horizon. The air in the barn was close and warm, carrying the mingled smells of hay, leather, and damp wool. She had been awake for hours, watching the shallow rise and fall of the stranger's chest. When he stirred, it was not with the quiet weakness of the night before, but with the sudden jolt of a man returning from the edge. His eyes snapped open, dark and sharp, and for a moment he seemed not to know where he was. His hand twitched toward his side, searching for something that wasn't there. She caught the movement and spoke low, telling him to be still. He froze, breath coming fast, the tension in him like a coiled rope. When she held out a tin cup of water, he hesitated, suspicion shadowing his face. The seconds stretched. Finally, he took it, drinking in slow, deliberate swallows, his gaze never leaving hers. The children kept to the doorway, peering in with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Her daughter's eyes were wide, full of questions she dared not ask. The boy's jaw was set, his stance guarded. They had grown used to visitors meaning trouble, and this one, lying half-healed in their barn, was no exception. The day passed in a strange rhythm. The Comanche, she could not think of him any other way, moved little, conserving strength. She checked his bandage, changed the cloth when it grew heavy with fresh blood. He spoke few words, and those he did manage were halting, his English broken and spare. Still, there was something steady in his tone, a calm that made her uneasy. He was not afraid of her, nor of his wounds. By afternoon, he had risen to sit on the edge of the blankets, his bare feet planted in the straw. She found him watching the open doorway, eyes fixed on the endless prairie as though measuring the distance to somewhere else. When she came to tend the fire in the small stove, he lifted a hand, not to stop her, but a gesture toward the fence beyond. One of the rails had come loose, sagging in the wind. She told him to rest, but he ignored her, forcing himself upright with a quiet grunt. The walk to the fence was slow, his body stiff and unsteady, yet he carried himself like a man unwilling to show weakness. He knelt, set the rail back in place, and secured it with twine she had left from the last repair. It was a small thing, but she understood the meaning, an offering, however meager. Her daughter trailed him on the way back, smiling in a way that made the widow uneasy. It was the boy who voiced what she herself was thinking, pulling her aside once they reached the porch. "He's dangerous," the boy whispered. She told him to keep his voice down, though she didn't disagree. That night, the air was sharp with the scent of rain again, and the prairie seemed to hold its breath. She found herself listening for the sound of hoofbeats, scanning the dark for any sign of movement. He noticed, though she tried to hide it. Later, when the children were inside, he pointed toward the far ridge, where a faint scarring of the grass told a story she had not yet read. Riders had passed there recently, no more than a handful, their trail fresh. Whether they were his people or his enemies, he did not say. They sat across from each other in the dim light, the lantern flames swaying between them. He spoke then, the words coming slowly, as if weighed before release. He told her of an ambush, men from a rival band, though the reason for their attack was left unsaid. He had been cut off, left to die. He mentioned traitors, too, and betrayal, but his gaze slid away as he said it, as though the telling cost him something. She listened without interrupting, aware of the silence that stretched between each sentence. The shape of his story was incomplete, and she doubted he meant to fill in the missing pieces. Still, something in his voice told her it was not a lie. The days bled into each other, the fragile peace holding by unspoken agreement. He moved more easily now, enough to help with the chores. She caught him showing her daughter how to throw a knife, his hands guiding the small fingers with surprising gentleness. The girl's laughter was soft but unguarded, a sound the widow hadn't heard in a long time. It was a boy who broke the moment, stepping between them and taking the knife from his sister's hand. The Comanche met the boy's glare without flinching, then handed the weapon back to the widow. She told him, with a firmness she hoped would hold, not to teach her children things meant for war. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that might have been respect or defiance. That night, she dreamed of hoofbeats again, only to wake and find the sound real. Faint but steady, carrying across the wind. She stepped outside into the cold, her breath clouding in the dark. Far to the west, a solitary rider moved along the ridge. The distance made it impossible to see details, but she could feel the weight of the stranger's presence even from here. When she turned, she found him standing in the barn doorway, his face unreadable. His gaze was fixed on the rider, and though he said nothing, the set of his jaw told her enough. Whoever it was, they were not a friend. The rider vanished into the low swell of land, leaving only the quiet and the whisper of grass and wind. She looked back at the Comanche, and in that moment she understood that whatever had brought him here had not been left behind. It was coming still, carried toward them on the long breath of the prairie. She closed the barn door against the night, but the knowledge settled in her bones. The danger was no longer somewhere far away. It had found their horizon, and it would not turn back. Dawn came muted, the light thin and gray as if the sun had risen reluctantly. The air was sharp, carrying the brittle scent of frost. He was already awake, standing at the edge of the yard with his eyes fixed on the far horizon. She stepped out onto the porch, pulling her shawl tight. He lifted his chin slightly toward the open land, where faint plumes of smoke curled upward in deliberate intervals. They were too regular, too ordered to be the work of chance. She felt her stomach tighten. He said nothing, but she could read the warning in the lines of his face. Those signals meant eyes were watching. Whether they belonged to soldiers, bounty men, or his own people turned hostile, it hardly mattered. Out here, anyone with reason to send such signs would bring trouble. Over breakfast, he broke his silence. In halting words, he spoke of the night before she found him, of a raid gone wrong. His voice was flat, stripped of embellishment, but beneath it ran a current of anger held in check. He claimed it had been in defense, that they had taken no more than what was owed, but the men who had struck back had done so with more than bullets. They had taken something sacred from him, and he had left one of their own dead in the dust. She did not ask what that something was, though her eyes drifted to the leather pouch he kept near, hidden in the barn's loft. Then he said something that made her pause. She could turn him in. The bounty would be enough to keep her and the children through the winter, maybe longer. He said it without bitterness, like a man stating a fact. She told him she wouldn't, though she didn't know if that was mercy or stubbornness. By midday, the air had shifted. The wind carried a faint tremor, a sound that wasn't quite there until it was. Hooves, many of them, distant but closing. She sent the children inside and barred the door. He was already moving, limping toward the barn, gathering what little ammunition they had. His hands moved with practiced precision, even in his weakened state. Dusk began to rise on the far edge of the prairie. A low cloud smeared across the pale sky. Figures emerged slowly, black against the light, growing sharper with each heartbeat. There were 6 riders, their formation loose but deliberate. She could feel their gaze even before she could see their faces. He stood beside her on the porch, rifle in hand, and asked her a question with his eyes. Fight or flee? There was no choice. Fleeing meant turning their backs, and the open land offered no shelter. She nodded once, and he understood. The first shot came sudden and sharp, shattering the corner of the porch rail. She flinched but didn't step back. He answered with his own shot, the sound rolling across the plains like thunder. One of the riders peeled away, circling wide. Another pair dismounted, moving low toward the cabin. She ran for the children, ushering them down into the cellar, her voice tight but calm. She told them not to make a sound, no matter what they heard above. When she returned, he had taken cover behind the barn door, firing in measured bursts, each shot deliberate. She joined him, the weight of the rifle familiar in her hands despite how long it had been since she'd used it. A bullet struck the window, glass splintering inward. The crack of gunfire was matched by the pounding of boots as one of the men tried to rush the side of the cabin. The Comanche caught him mid-stride, the shot clean and final. The man fell hard, the thud swallowed by the roar of the wind. The riders did not retreat. They moved like men who had time on their side, probing the edges of their defenses, looking for a break. She could feel the tension winding tighter, each moment stretched thin. Her breath came quick, though her hands were steady. As the light began to fade, the dust clouds settled low, the attackers holding their distance. The silence was worse than the gunfire. It felt like the pause before a storm's last, violent push. She glanced at him, and for the first time she saw the strain in his face. Not fear, but the weight of calculation. He was measuring odds, and they weren't good. He told her in a low voice that nightfall would be their chance. If they waited for darkness, he could slip around, strike from the side, scatter them before they regrouped. She didn't ask how he planned to manage it with his wounds. She knew better than to question a man who had already decided to risk himself. Outside, the prairie swallowed the last of the daylight. The riders faded into shadows, their campfire embers barely visible in the far dark. The wind stilled, and the air grew thick, holding its breath. She checked the cellar door once more, listening to the children's whispers. When she stepped back into the barn, he was ready, his rifle strapped across his back, a knife at his belt. The lines of his face were harder in the lamplight, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the wooden walls. She realized then that the danger pressing against their door was not just hers to endure. Whatever waited out there was tied to him, bound by blood and debt, and it would not be satisfied until it had been faced. He looked at her once more before he vanished into the night, and in that single glance there was both farewell and promise. The door closed behind him without a sound, leaving her alone in the quiet, her heart counting the seconds until the fight began again. Rain had begun to fall by the time she heard the first muffled cry in the distance. It was faint, carried to the night air, but was enough to tell her he had reached them. The sound came again, shouts in a language she didn't know, followed by the crack of gunfire. She moved to the window, careful to keep herself in shadow. The prairie beyond was a shifting blur of rain and darkness, lit now and again by the pale flash of a rifle shot. He moved like a shadow himself, darting low between the shapes of the enemy camp. Two men dropped soundlessly before the others even knew he was there. She could see the way he used the storm, each gust of wind, each roll of thunder, to mask his approach. For a moment she almost forgot he was the same man she had carried half dead into her barn. Then a voice cut through the night, harsh and guttural, commanding. A figure stepped forward from the cluster of men, a broad-shouldered trader in a weathered coat, the brim of his hat low over his brow. Even at this distance she could sense the recognition between them. This was no nameless enemy. This was a man the Comanche had been chasing through miles of open land, the one who had taken whatever lay in that leather pouch. The trader's voice carried, mocking. He spoke of payment, of betrayal, of kin lost in the dust. She couldn't catch every word, but she saw the way the Comanche stiffened, his shoulders squaring as if the rain itself were driving him forward. The gunfire started again, closer this time, as the attackers tried to flush him into the open. She pulled her rifle from its place by the wall, checked the rounds, and slipped out onto the porch. The air was cold, the rain soaking through her shawl in seconds. A shadow detached itself in the dark. A man running low toward the cabin, pistol raised. She didn't hesitate. Her shot cracked through the storm, dropping him a dozen paces from the steps. Her hands were steady, though her pulse thundered in her ears. More shouts rose from the enemy camp, followed by a rush of movement. She could hear boots pounding through the wet grass, coming for the cabin. She ducked back inside, bracing the door, but another crash came from the rear. One of them had found the cellar hatch. The children's frightened voices echoed faintly below. She swung the rifle around, firing through the open back doorway. The man fell halfway down the steps, his pistol clattering into the dark. The sound of her own breath filled her ears. Outside, the shouts grew more chaotic, the fight turning brutal and close. Through the rain-hazed dark, she saw them, Comanche and Trader, circling each other in the open yard. The Trader had discarded his gun, a long knife glinting in his hand. The Comanche moved with the precision of a man whose every muscle remembered violence. They clashed in the mud, the sound of steel striking steel lost under the downpour. The fight was vicious, each man driving the other through the churned earth. The Trader's blade caught the Comanche's side, drawing a sharp grunt of pain. She raised her rifle, ready to end it, but the distance was too uncertain, and the rain made every shape shift in her vision. With a sudden burst, the Comanche drove the Trader back, twisting the knife from his grip. The final strike was swift and silent. The Trader fell, his body sinking into the mud as the rain washed over him. For a moment the Comanche just stood there, chest heaving, the storm streaming down his face. The remaining riders saw the fall and broke. They scattered into the night, the sound of hooves fading until it was swallowed by the storm. She lowered her rifle, her arms aching from the strain she hadn't noticed until now. By the time he came to the porch, his steps were heavy, his wound darkening his side again. She met him in the doorway, searching his face for something, relief perhaps, or remorse, but found only weariness. He said nothing, only glanced toward the barn where his horse waited. She knew then he would not stay. Dawn came quietly, the sky a pale wash of gold and gray. The yard was littered with the signs of what had passed. Mud churned deep, a few scattered weapons, the ground still dark with rain and blood. He stood beside his horse, the leather pouch tied once more to his side. The children watched from the porch as he swung into the saddle. He met her eyes one last time, and though no words passed between them, she understood what was carried in that look. Gratitude, warning, and the weight of a path he could not turn from. She did not ask him to stay. The horizon was already calling him, and men like him belonged to it more than to any roof or hearth. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat in a silent farewell, then turned his horse toward the open land. They watched until he was nothing more than a dark shape against the rising light. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of wet earth and smoke. She stood there long after he was gone, her hand resting lightly on the porch rail. The children close by. Life would return to its rhythm soon enough. Would it split? Fences to mend in the long, quiet days of the frontier. But she knew the world had shifted in some small, irrevocable way. Somewhere out there, a man she had saved rode with a mark on his life, just as he had left his on hers. The prairie was silent again, but it no longer felt empty.